And that actually turns out to be, weirdly enough, even though it's a worldview that's predicated on this underlying social cognitive structure, it turns out to be a worldview that's unbelievably useful because it happens to map onto the structure of subjective experience extremely well. In that, wherever you go, you're viewing the world through a cultural lens, and you're usually encapsulated in a culture as well. I mean, it's virtually impossible now to go anywhere where culture isn't with you and around you. I mean, you can do it from time to time. But even if you manage that, it's still inside you. It's coded in the way that you behave, and it's structured the way you perceive things and think about them. So even if the outside world is devoid of cultural artifacts, doesn't matter because you're a cultural artifact right to your core.
Hi, you are a cultural artifact. Why are you a cultural artifact? You're a cultural artifact because culture is expressing itself to you. Why am I making this video? I'm making this video because if you want to improve and live a better and happier life, you have to understand the interconnection between you and culture, because it's having a very big effect on who you are and how you're leading your life. You just saw an intro from Jordan Peterson. He had a lecture series 2014 on personality. I think it's lecture 3 or 4. I think heroism and shamanism. And in this little section here, he talks about culture and nature and your cultural artifacts. So we tend to think of a cultural artifact, for example, as being like an old phone or TV from years ago. Now you can watch old movies, say movies from 1950, and you think, yeah, whatever. But if you, say for example, if you go to a museum, I went to a museum once, and it was interesting, not an ancient museum, but a modern technology museum, where they showed what people were using, devices people were using in 1940, 1950, and 1960. And you go back and see what people were using in 1950, it makes you realize how primitive it was and how different their world was. Like you had the old phone, the ring-up phone, and then the operator cable, and the operator will plug you in, you know, very primitive stuff, and old small TV sets. And it's just, when you see it, when you're there, it's a different vibe. Because these are cultural artifacts, not just because they're old tech. They're cultural artifacts because they're telling you something about that age, about the values that people had and the mindset that people have. But not only does the technology tell us something about civilization, you tell us something, because the way you're living your life, the viewpoints that you have, the perspectives are a reflection of that. So I'm going to show a couple more clips from Jordan Peterson. He's going to talk about culture, he's going to talk about nature, and I'll explain a little bit and then tie in how it all interconnects, because it really has a big effect on self-improvement. And I think if we don't take culture into account, it makes it very, very hard to understand your psychology and to grow and develop as human beings. So let's take a look at the next clip.
Despite that, and it's the incorporation of the culture that allows you to maneuver and live and act and do that somewhat successfully. Despite that you're enculturated and embedded in culture, nature can pop up and disturb you pretty much at any moment. And that happens when whatever it is that you're doing doesn't work. The best way of managing it is to think of the figure of Mother Nature, and that would be Mary here, and it would be Isis there. Now, nature is a funny thing, because I don't want you to think about nature the way that modern people think about nature. I want you to think about nature as that which lurks outside of culture. So imagine in the typical tribal scene, or let's say in the typical rather primeval village or gathering, there's a domain that people inhabit that they're sort of comfortable with. That's where all the people are, that's where the dominance hierarchy is, and then that's sort of surrounded by God only knows what. Like the outside world, the barbarians, the darkness that eats the sun when it goes down at night, all the things that are foreign and uncomfortable are outside of that circle, and that's nature. What's outside of culture is nature. And so nature is the unknown. And then what's inside is culture, that's the known.
So in this clip, he's basically talking about the nature of nature and the nature of culture. That culture is the known, and nature is the unknown. Nature is always that which lies outside. Now we have concepts, if you go back to Jacques Lacan, famous French psychoanalyst, he had a concept of a thing called the real. The real is experience, but you can't understand it. You can only understand the symbolic realm. And the symbolic realm, to some degree, is the culture you're living in, Culture is always inside a symbolic realm. So something could be happening around you, but if it doesn't lie within culture, you won't really understand it. It has to have some cultural reference point, okay? So there could be all sorts of things. As a matter of fact, there is all sorts of things happening around us. Neutrinos are flying through us. We're perceptive in a very small part of the electromagnetic range. Many things are happening, and apparently, according to physicists, there's all sorts of parallel universes and dual realities and stuff happening, and that things aren't quite as they seem. But we don't see those. We only see within our framework, within that narrow framework of the culture that we live in. That's what we see and that's what we perceive. And so culture is the known, and we always want to stay within culture. Nature is somewhat transcendent about it. Let's take a look at another clip here.
So the way that humanity naturally perceives the world and symbolizes the world is as a place that's basically composed of culture. And culture is where you are when things are going according to how you want them to go. That's sort of the definition of knowing. Right? It's not knowing a set of facts. It's knowing how to behave so that the ends that you're pursuing get acquired. And that's more important in many ways than knowing facts.
Okay, so what he's doing here is he's clarifying, again, the difference between nature and culture. Culture is the known. And as he says here, nature is that which pops up when things don't work. You're seeing nature. So nature is a transcendent force. Nature is a disruptive force. So he'll go into talking about how, disease and life going badly, etc., are all affected by nature. So nature is non-culture, the outer reality, chaos versus the anarchy of culture.
Facts may help you do that, but they may not too. So there's the place you are when you know what you're doing and you get what you want, and then there's that other place that pops up all the time where you haven't got a clue about what to do. And that's the place it's like a transcendent place, and that's nature. And the transcendent place is where all the mysteries of life come from, the things that you cannot handle, the diseases, the illnesses, death, disappointments, frustrations, all the things that knock you for a loop and make you tumble underground. And that's nature like a predator.
So I think the way he is describing nature, he talks about it as being the mysteries of life, and nature is like a predator. So it's a very specific way he's taking about it, because I would tend to think of the mysteries of life could be very enlightening and amazing mysteries, learning new things. And nature can be wonderful and beautiful. So you might be thinking, this guy's got some ideas, odd ideas about nature. We tend to think of nature as beautiful landscapes and so on. But that's not the kind of nature he's talking about. He's talking very much in terms of anthropological, sociological, psychological, philosophical viewpoints about the nature of order and chaos in the universe. At least that's how I take it. And those examples I gave earlier, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, which I think is very relevant. The idea that there is a thing called a real, that's a reality. He has the idea that there's a symbolic order which we're trying to head towards. It's kind of the ideal, like Plato's ideal people. And then there is what Lacan also talks about, the mirror phase, which is basically that we try and copy the world and become false versions of ourselves in the process. Another interpretation which I like to talk about, which I think is very parallel to Lacan, maybe he was copying Lacan, maybe Lacan was copying him, I don't know, but Carlos Castaneda and his idea, the guys into shamanism, that this thing called the Nagual and tonal, and people say this Castaneda was real, was Castaneda not real? I don't know, but I think his concept is right up there with Lacan, who's a structuralist. That was the kind of school he came from, which is basically that there is, the Nagual is like nature, it's everything out there, and you can't deal with it really. And then you have the tonal, which is the world around you, and you can live within that world. So from the point of view, now of course in Castaneda we talk about the necessity to enter into the Nagual, to go beyond the tonal, because as long as you're in the tonal, again, these are slightly different interpretations. So remember what Castaneda is saying is different from what Lacan is saying, is different from Peterson. But just to give you a little nuance there, Castaneda's idea is basically that as long as you stay in the tonal, it's like the world of everything's very boring and how do I pay my bills? And we have to transcend that. And so nature is always transcendent. We're going into that Nagual, we're going into that real. The problem we have is we can't live in that, because we have to live in a shared reality. You know what I mean? If you imagine, for example, if you're If you sit down with somebody who's taking loads of drugs and they're on a trip, you're both in the same room, but you're in different realities. So we have to have some common meeting place. So when he's talking about nature, he's talking about that transcendent force, not in the good sense of God, but rather something brutal and harsh that's chaos and anarchy. Certainly, this is how I read it, and I'm not saying I'm reading exactly right, but this as far as I can. So we also have to understand when we read things or watch things, we have to try and get some idea of where the author's coming from. And if you're not so well read, you might not necessarily capture that. You might think, God, this guy is a bit radical. I don't think he's so radical, although he doesn't exactly give references. We're watching a college lecture. Maybe if you're there, he'd have references and they make more sense. But as I see it, he's basically talking about chaos and order. Now, what does this have to do with you and psychology being happier? I think the point, what I took out of this, and it's kept in my head, is that you are a cultural artifact. Okay, we could talk about culture is our efforts, which is always hard. It's always hard to be a success. It's always hard to create civilization. It's hard to create a family. It's hard to have relationships. It's hard to have romance that works. It's hard to have a relationship with your kids. It's hard to get on with other people. It's hard to maintain your health. It is hard to maintain civilization because entropy and chaos is pulling at us. And while nature, in the sense of, ooh, look at plants and trees, is beautiful, there's also the other aspect, which is, ooh, we're in a universe, a little planet whizzing around at high speed. Everything else is pretty bleak out there. We're not exactly seeing beautiful planets everywhere. It seems to be fairly rare to have beautiful worlds and civilizations. It's rare to have a beautiful world, and it's even more rare to have a beautiful civilization. And we actually have a beautiful civilization, although there's many issues. And I think we could probably improve a lot if we could change our mindset. But that's a story for another day. So just to wrap up here, how do I use this when trying to improve as a human being? Is to realize, okay, I'm just giving that background of where Peterson's coming from. But the way I'm interpreting, I'm looking at it is, if I want to become a better version of myself, I have to understand that I am an expression of culture. I am a cultural artifact. The opinions, the values I have are also part of culture. And there's many other aspects. I put a few videos up of this recently, and you can go back to his original video and you can see the kind of context here. He talks about how people will jump in to fight in a war, for example, which is not a natural thing to do. We usually naturally into self-preservation, but sometimes the drive for civilization overcomes that drive for self-preservation. So, for the point of view of improving psychologically, is to realize the effect of culture. So, the cultural framework. What TV programs did I watch as a kid? What books did I read? What movies did I watch? What am I watching now on YouTube or social media? Or what books I'm reading? What people am I listening to? What podcasts am I listening to? What conversations am I having with the people around me? When I was a kid, I watched an awful lot of TV because my house TV was always on. And later on, when I started working on myself and developing myself as a person, I found it was so much of this kind of junk in my head of old TV programs and movies and stuff. And it's like we're just putting stuff in, but we're never taking something out. So for you, this is my little twist on this. For you to be happy, we got this situation that we got a world and shared everything, which means I have to keep compromising. Otherwise, I have to live on my own. And it's the old saying, which is no man is an island. And living on your own is difficult. Living in a cave is difficult. We have physical needs and emotional needs. And basically, by and large, we need other people in our lives. And so we have to compromise. But there's also your own unique self. And so to get to that unique self, we have to declutter all this cultural crap. Because it's a very weird thing when you think about it. You're a small little baby, you're just lying there, just taking it all in. All this programming is coming in, inputs. So I mentioned this in the last video I think I made on this, which is that culture is very useful. Culture will give you an in, but culture will not give you an out. Okay? Culture allows you to identify with a group without having to work at it. It's very useful in a small kid to just fit in. You go to a ball game, you put on the outfit, and all that stuff. Okay? You fit in with zero effort. But it's generic, and you are not generic, and you will never be as happy as long as you're generic. You have to stand out. So culture lets you fit in. Culture will never let you stand out. Now, some people in our culture will be a lot of that status of popular and successful. So successful business people, news broadcasters, stars, different kind of hierarchies of people who are popular and successful and are put on a pedestal. Tiny percentage of the overall population. And even if you are one of those people, you'll probably go home and think, I don't know why, but I still feel unfulfilled. I don't know why I feel unfulfilled. I'm apparently a celebrity, okay? You're unfulfilled because you're still generic. You're a generic celebrity. You're generically what everybody expects you to be. And we all go, ha ha, hoo hoo, this person's part of the ideal. But you're not you. So as long as you're not you, you're going to have a problem. So what to do about it? What to do about it is to declutter yourself from culture. Now, you can never completely leave it. You know, I was raised as a Christian. I can never totally de-Christianize myself. A lot of the thinking is there. The viewpoints is there. I could be not so attached to it, but I'm basically, I was raised a Christian, I was raised an Irishman, etc., etc., etc. So there's no point in leaving. I can't leave my identity. I have my identity. But I have to find my individual identity, not just my cultural identity. So yes, I am a cultural artifact. I was born in a certain era, a certain mindset. I saw certain perceptions. But I don't have to stay there. To some degree, they will always be there. You can't fully get rid of them. But we can declutter ourselves and deprogram ourselves to some degree. So it's fine if you're, you know, from Europe or you're from Asia or America and you have those cultural reference points and you have that heritage. It's fine, but you should be more than that heritage. So I'm going to talk about different transcendence. So he's talking transcendence as in the chaos and the anarchy that it transcends culture. Culture is like a tiny island of beauty in this wilderness. And I'm going to talk about different transcendence, individual transcendence, which is more civilization. Civilization, he's talking about in the broad brushstrokes of everybody together. I'm talking about my becoming me, actualization, liberalization, self-realization, all that good stuff, which is becoming myself. So I still have this body and identity and history, but I'm not totally attached to its aspect to me. And I can only go beyond, I can only transcend my generic culture when I start seeing what is my culture and I can put a perspective on it. I can see me. And of course, I think there's lots of things you have to do to work on that, is things like meditation, therapy, diary writing, reading books, what I call mind feed books and videos and podcasts. But try and think about what are we letting in? And are we just letting in? Because many people are just letting in and then they just spit out whatever was inputted, but they're not being themselves. And so we need to do more soul searching to find out who we are and express that. So you are a cultural artifact, but you're not just a cultural artifact. You're something beyond that. And it's something we should strive towards to do and to understand in our journey towards self-actualization is that individuation is what is the effect of all this in the background. It is having an effect on me, and it's not that it's wrong, it's good, it's fine, it's not bad coming from a certain place, having a certain background, but I should be more than just that. But if I don't see it, it's just like the concept of Jung with the shadow self. If I don't see it, it's there pulling the strings in the corner. It's affecting me while not seeing it. So if I work on myself and become aware, I am a cultural artifact. I'm strongly affected by my history and my background, but I can become aware of it and detach myself, not be so attached to it, and transcend to a higher perspective. And this is very important, that we have to see how culture has affected how we look at the world. And I have a lot of experience in this myself here because I live in a different country. I live in India, I was raised in Ireland, and obviously I'm in a different culture. And like Venn diagrams, there's some overlap, but often there's not much overlap. And it's interesting to see what to identify with and what I don't identify with. It's a challenge if you go to a different culture and live in a different bunch of people. It kind of throws back your own cultural reference points and perhaps prejudices and so on. It makes you realize, oh, right, why am I thinking that? And is that so relevant or not? And we have to do this. This is more civilization, that we're more than simply a cultural artifact. Hope you liked that video. Please like and subscribe. If you do, comment. Always very interesting. I'm not saying I have everything fully worked out here. It's just my perspective. Okay, talk to you next time.